This happens in many big corporations that we're still working with now, is that person becomes the pariah, right? That person is the person that you need to, like a whack-a-mole. Have you played that game that you need to whack the heads? That person usually gets whacked on the head. And so after 2 or 3 times of getting whacked, she realizes that that's a no-go.
This is Mojob's Start With Who, the series for those who work on attracting and selecting the right candidates. Today, you'll meet the amazing Faderico Lozano from Academy, and you can learn how he find and advise teams that make awesome stuff. Welcome to this episode of Start With Who. Today, we have the first interview ever in English, so that will be exciting. And our guest is Faderico Lozano from Academy, NTNU, NIH. Many places, I guess. And I'm so stoked to have you here. Wow. I've learned so much from you. You're probably the person in the world that I learned the most from, whom I've actually met.
Wow.
So,
that's huge. Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm so happy to have you here. So excited. Would you just give the audience a quick introduction of who you are yourself? I'm not going to take that one from you.
Sure thing. So I am Fede Lozano. Fede is way easier than Federico. As Tobias mentioned, I wear a lot of different hats. I teach at NTNU, I teach at NHH, and I also run my own business, Academy. We're an international training organization that helps companies of all shapes and sizes and colors and flavors to basically innovate and lead. So that's my bread and butter, to help people and organizations change stuff.
Nice, nice. That's a good summary. But I'm really curious to hear, like, where are you from? Where did your story start?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a mutt. I'm a pretty big mix culturally. So I was born in Mexico City in 1979, so 40 years ago. And I didn't spend too much time there before my parents decided to move to the US. My father is this crazy entrepreneur guy who kind of was like this constant nomad jumping back and forth. And so one of our first moves was to San Diego, California. And that's where I grew up. I grew up in sunny San Diego, America's finest city. It's a beautiful place. And yeah, I kind of adopted a lot of American values and attitudes. There was a point though where my parents were like, maybe the US doesn't feel that good after all. Okay. And we moved to Europe for a while, to Spain. My mother's family is Spanish. My grandparents are Spanish Civil War refugees. So we spent some time in Spain. And then we literally, just to make the story short, we bounced back and forth between Spain, the US, and Mexico around 6 or 7 times before I actually graduated high school.
Okay, wow. But you identify as American?
That's a really difficult question to answer. Okay. I've been asked it many, many times before. I really do feel like I am a blend of a lot of different cultures, right? So Latin American, most definitely, because that's essentially kind of my family roots. Right. But then when it comes to like ancestors, they're definitely European and Spanish, right? And then spending a lot of time growing up as a young kid, it's definitely American. And so that's where I picked up this like thick accent and a lot of my attitude. But then there's also the huge influence I've been receiving in the last 6 years in Norway, which has had a tremendous impact on the way that I see myself. Right. So at the end of the day, it's a weird mix.
Sweet. But like growing up, what was your ambitions? What were like critical points that led you to where you are today? What was your first like goal you remember? Career-wise?
So entrepreneurship has always been a huge thing in my family. Right. Not only was my father an entrepreneur, but all of my uncles were entrepreneurs. And so like the whole idea of launching something for yourself and like pulling yourself from like your bootstraps and just going out there and sort of taking over the world was very, very dominant in my house when I grew up.
So what was your first entrepreneurial experience?
So it was very, very simply my father and his elder brother, they launched the first auto parts distributor in Mexico. And they were really, really lucky that it was like in the early 70s when like dragsters were catching on in Mexico. You know, those like races of like from like the 50s and the 60s in the States. It sort of took on a life of its own in the 70s in Mexico. And so my parents were in the right place at the right time. They started to have a lot of success. And so I started working with my dad in his auto parts business at a very, very young age. I think I was like 6 or 7 when he started to take me to his office, and I got into like sales and marketing and into all the technical details of the tires and the wheels. And I fell in love with it. I was absolutely thrilled. Just imagine a 6-year-old kid in like a car environment. Yeah. It's like perfect. Yeah. So that was like my exposure to entrepreneurship. Yeah. Things ended up changing a lot for me in the way that I saw that particular experience. But that's a whole new conversation. But initially it was definitely through my father's success in building companies.
Right. And then you actually have an MBA from Stanford.
Yeah.
What was your road going there? Was that you always had a goal of reaching that?
Yeah. So one thing that I could definitely say is that my parents inculcated a very strong sense of achievement in me, and that's just to put it lightly. They've always pushed my sister and I to achieve a lot. They've been tactful around it, and so they weren't too forceful, but I knew that that was sort of where I wanted to arrive. I since I can remember, I've always thought that going to a place like Stanford was where I needed to be. For good and bad, by the way, and I can tell you more stories about that later. But the goal there was to learn as much as possible about being the most impactful entrepreneur that I could be. The initial idea was like to professionalize all of the work that my dad had done with his family for 30, 40 years and sort of bring it to a higher level.
So when you went to school, he still had his business?
Definitely, yes. Yes. Okay. So I was still considering whether to go back and help him with that. And I also had a lot of ideas of my own. And so Silicon Valley was kind of like the perfect place to start to explore those ideas. Yeah.
And now, like, Stanford is probably the toughest school to get into in the whole world, right?
I guess it's definitely hard.
Yeah. I also remember you told me a story once from the Stanford time where you actually took a year off.
Yep.
I think that's a very, very good story that represents a lot of what you do today. Yep.
So it wasn't necessarily a year, it was like 2.5 months, but it really marked my experience there. I went from the first year of my MBA kind of like really, without the kind of, like really struggling with the actual content that was being delivered in class. It was highly quantitative. And I'd always kind of been comfortable enough to be kind of considered like one of the smartest kids in class until I arrived there. And it was like absolute and utter shock. Yeah. The great thing is that very soon I realized that everyone else was going through the same kind of shock, right? Whether you were an astronaut or a physicist or a social scientist. From my perspective, we were all struggling in that first year. But that break between the first and the second year made a huge difference in the way that I experienced my MBA. I had a chance to travel to India to help launch what has now become probably the most successful social enterprise in the world, Delight Design. They're a solar lighting distribution company. And when I started there, I was literally their second employee. And now they have tens of thousands of employees in, I don't know, like 50, 60, 70 different countries around the world. So it was an absolutely incredible experience to kind of apply all of the stuff that I had initially learned during that first year and kind of see much more of the relevance of it in a really, really exciting context that is India. I mean, it doesn't get more exciting of a country than there, right? And so it was really mind-opening. And one of the most important things about my experience in India was that that was the first time that I got exposed to design thinking, which I'm hoping that we're going to talk a little bit about in the future, but that's the methodology that I teach now.
Right. And that was something you learned from Stanford, the stuff you practiced there?
Yeah. It was interesting because during that first year, it was so heavy on the business stuff that I didn't get a chance to really explore all of the other wonderful opportunities that Stanford had to offer. It wasn't until I came back from India with that sort of design bug in my system that I really kind of started to reach out into a lot of different areas, and I became much more explorative in the way that I approached my education. And so that second year at Stanford was just, it was so incredibly eye-opening and revealing and engaging and exciting because I finally had found that sort of place to channel all of my energies. I wasn't channeling my energies through finance and strategy, that's for sure, and definitely not accounting. And I took like 3 accounting classes. I almost failed all of them, right? But finally I found this design thinking space that is heavily led through social interaction. And I've always been a really social person, as you can tell, right? And so I managed to finally find something that would help me continue to build successful businesses and be a good entrepreneur, while at the same time focusing on what really mattered to me, which was kind of like empathic connections with other humans.
So when you started that company that summer, I suppose, you didn't only like go to India, you actually like lived with people. Like,
so just important, I didn't launch the company. I was essentially just hired into a company that was launched by these 2 incredible, absolutely masterful entrepreneurs. But yeah, I think one of the most eye-opening experiences is that we actually realized that the only way to build a product or a service, because we were doing both product and service, that has meaning in somebody's life is to actually participate in that person's life. Kind of makes sense, right? The thing is that we forget about that in business. We focus way too much on the tools and on the frameworks and on the theories and the bottom line and all these spreadsheets and all this shit. And that gets in the way of us actually just sitting down and having conversations with the people whom we are serving, right? And so that was absolutely eye-opening, that going to people's homes and seeing how they interacted with lighting solutions, or the lack thereof, because we were going to like really poor places in India, northern India, was what made the difference. And that's why D-Light Design is what it is now. It was because since the very, very start, Sam Goldman, the founder and CEO, was obsessed about humans and not necessarily obsessed about the gadgets that humans used.
Yeah, right. So would you actually then, you moved in with an Indian family, observed how they interacted with light? What was one of the key insights you learned that you wouldn't have learned otherwise?
Yeah. Wow, so there were a lot of different things. So one is like this obsession with education that families have for kids. I mean, we'd heard about that and we'd read about it a little bit, but everything surrounded the future educational success of the kids. And in a lot of the households we were visiting, there were lots of kids, like 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8 sometimes. And so one of the biggest takeaways was that these kids, they were the ones using the kerosene lamps that were so dirty, and they were creating really high rates of lung cancer, because these kids, they were huddling around these nasty kerosene lamps with all this like thick black smoke coming out of it, right? Simply to be able to study until like late hours into the night, because that was what they needed to do. And so we realized that was a significant need. We needed to remove those damn kerosene lamps from the face of the earth, right? That was our guiding mission, at least in those days. But that's something that we would have never, ever realized if we were doing research at Stanford, right? Talking to electricity experts or visiting Tesla. Or it's not something that you find out until you actually get there. You realize why you're doing what you're doing.
Totally. But now back to the day. You're working, like, seems like the core of what you're doing is embodied in Procademy.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell the audience a bit about what you guys do and what you believe in?
Sure.
To teach companies.
Sure. So Procademy is above and beyond anything, it's a team. And man, does that get me excited. Like I worked on launching Procademy alone for, 2 years-ish. And that wasn't a lot of fun. It was interesting to see how my ideas caught on, but it wasn't that exciting. As soon as I managed to attract and bring on board some amazing people, that's when shit got incredible. And so we're a team of 10 really, really, really diverse people, everything from like a 79-year-old creativity scholar from Korea to, to Jay-Ho, he's amazing. Hello there, Jay-Ho. To a incredibly successful NTNU professor in mechanical engineering, Martin Steinert, to a young absolutely insanely talented Colombian woman who's a postdoc at NTNU and is a hardcore psychologist. She's been a psychologist for her bachelor's, for her master's, for her PhD, and now her postdoc. And so she's bringing all of this wonderful psychological, emotional, female vibe to our team. And of course, we've got Ula, who's like the guy that keeps the whole ship running, and Matthew, who's like the teams and trainer guy, and Joao, the digital dude. And I mean, I can go on and on. It's just so fascinating to finally be able to take a little bit of a step back and realize that the true beauty of building a company, at least for me, and I know it's definitely for you too, because we've talked about this before, is like the human component of creating kind of like this. I would think of it as like it's like a economically productive family, right? If you think about it in that way. And so that's been a huge trip for us. And by the way, all these people, they're also my closest friends, which is a bit mind-blowing. Like I have the wonderful opportunity, privilege to be able to work on the shit that I absolutely love with the people that I absolutely love, right? And so now what do? So essentially, as I mentioned in the introduction, we put all of those 10 heads together in order to enable particular firms leverage the power of design thinking and innovation leadership in order to take a safe step into the 21st century. And that word safe is really important, right? Because companies, they're very hesitant to change. They know that they need to change, but they don't know how to do it in the most intelligent way possible. So we help them through training to be able to do that.
And you guys work with everything from startups to like the biggest companies in the Nordic, right?
Definitely. So that's how we sort of came into touch, right? Because we were really focused on one side of our work to help fast-growing, exciting startups to grow. But we also work with giants like Williamson and DNB, these really, really big companies, and everything in between. So we're not very picky on the kind of company we work with. We are most definitely picky on the kind of people in those companies that we work with, right? We're looking for individuals who already have curiosity and a mindset of exploration. And then we come in there and we do our interventions and we poke them and we push them and we motivate them and we excite them and we enable them to create some great stuff in their organizations.
Yeah. But assembling this team you now have, I suppose you recruited them mostly from your own network, right? But how did you figure out what kind of competency or people you needed? Did it just like you saw Ula and then just I need this, or what was it?
Yeah, kind of. So I'm incredibly lucky in that our entire recruitment process is so organic. Why? Because I teach a lot of really talented people, right? I get access to NHH, NTNU, not only that, but also other leading organizations where they're just bubbling in talent, right? And so I come in, I do my workshop, and I have a really good eye for talent, and so suddenly they just kind of emerge, right? And I'm like, look at that person, right? They've got the skills, they've got the mindset, they've got the motivation. They're also kind, good, compassionate, caring people. And then I start to bring them into my circle. And it's very simple. I just approach them and hey, you want to have a coffee? And then that turns into drinks, and then that turns into dinners, and then it blossoms into a friendship. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, we're working together.
Yeah. So your talent attraction strategy is basically just presenting good shit and then just becoming friends.
That's it. Yeah. So it's a privilege, right? Because we don't spend on recruitment.
Right. And I think many companies could learn from that. Like a lot of just putting out content, showing who you are, what you do, what you believe in, and people will come to you.
Yes, and I would say that it takes a little bit more. It takes the capacity to see your role as a leader, not only as an administrator, a manager, or a retainer of talent, but I've always been of the idea that we need to start to become way more human in business. So when I recruited Ula, or when I recruited Matthew, or when I recruited Olga, I wasn't recruiting a person who could help me grow my company. I was recruiting a partner in life. And this sounds, I know, very corny, and for some executives out there, particularly the dudes who hate this kind of talk, they're probably like, oh, kill me, this American guy is way too touchy-feely. But if you really think about it, there are firms out there that have this policy of like integrating people at really profound levels that help them buy into culture at really, really deep human levels. And that's what's gonna make them really perform at the end of the day, right? Because they're not doing it for you, they're not doing it for the bottom line, they're doing it for the entire cohesive culture that you've been able to create. Just a quick comment. So for example, Southwest Airlines, it's literally the only successful airline in the United States, right?
In the world.
In the world, maybe. And so Herb Kelleher, the founding CEO who recently died, unfortunately, he was obsessed about his employees to a really creepy level. Like he would stay up until like 4 a.m. having whiskey with the baggage handlers, for example, right? And he really encouraged people to bring in wives and husbands into the company and have them work together. And all that was like really weird at first. It was like, I think in the 80s, and the whole industry was like, this guy's completely off his rocker. But then they started to realize that he created the most cohesive, effective, and impactful corporate culture in the history of fucking corporate cultures. And he did it through love.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. Sounds smushy, but it's like...
It works.
Super effective. That's great. And when you are out working with corporations, startups, whatever, and see teams, what do you think recognizes... what qualities does an effective team have?
Yeah, we've been thinking about this for a really long time. So just to lay it out there, for the first 4 or 5 years when we were in the business, we kind of treated teams as a black box. We were like, oh, you can't really figure this out. Let's kind of just roll the dice and see what the hell happens. And we ended up realizing that that's probably not the best approach. And so now we've been thinking about this for 3 years, like really, in a really dedicated way. And so we ended up realizing that we didn't need to do all the research ourselves. Like we can actually sit on the shoulders of giants and really learn from what's been discovered. And so Google did this wonderful research called the Aristotle Project around 3 years ago. It became really popular because the New York Times published this really cool article around it. Right. And what they were trying to figure out was like what made the most effective, creative teams tick, right? Like, why did certain teams just completely fall apart as soon as they were tackling something creative and innovative? And why did some teams flourish, right? And so, typical Google style, they threw millions of dollars at it and put together all these brilliant minds, and they did quantitative and qualitative research, and they crunched the numbers, and they did all this awesome stuff. And the conclusion, it was really simple. It was the teams that managed to establish a sense of open vulnerability, right? In like academic speak, we call that psychological safety, right? Where people felt that they had the ability and the safety to express themselves very, very deeply at very personal levels. Right. Everything from like, I don't like that button on an app to like, I have terminal cancer. What are we gonna do about this, right? And those examples, by the way, they come straight from this New York Times article on the Aristotle Project. Yeah. So that was one thing they realized. And then there was a second thing that was just as important as that vulnerability and openness, which was reciprocity, right? This concept that when people do open up, they're gonna sooner or later expect and want others in the team to open up as well, right? So Google, I think, called it like equal amount of time of speaking or something. They had like their own Google Speak. But at the end of the day, it was about like sharing shit, right? So this conversation would probably be a little weird if I just kept on going and going and going and going and going. So sooner or later, you're gonna jump in, you're gonna be like, okay, hold on, I'm gonna ask more questions or I'm gonna comment something, right? So generally in human relations, we establish trust and long-lasting bonds of friendship and love through those two things, openness and sharing reciprocity. Right? And so that's what we're constantly looking for in the teams that we advise as trainers and consultants, but also we're constantly looking to stimulate that amongst ourselves as the Percademy team.
Take your own medicine.
Yeah, we try our best.
So when you're out talking to Norwegian big corporations or startups, whatever, what is the most common situation you see that they're in? Are they good in this department? Or is the span big? Or?
Yeah, of course it varies a lot because we work with very diverse kinds of companies. Yeah. There is something that kind of stands out a lot. And I've always hesitated a little bit to get into this thorny subject, but I'm going to just jump right in there because I feel really comfortable with you. We're really close friends, by the way. I don't know if you realized it, but I'm just going to lay that out there. Jantelov.
Yeah, Jantelov.
This damn Jante, right? Like, I know that you guys believe in it strongly. And by the way, one of the reasons why I live in Norway is because of Jante. Jante creates wonderfully functional societies, right? So I'm not trying to transplant Silicon Valley values onto Norway because that would be fucked up. Silicon Valley values are not sane, right? Having said that, when you take Jantelov to the extreme and you don't know how to pause it a bit or maybe just turn it down a bit, it keeps people from fully expressing their creative spirit. Right? This whole idea of like, you're equal, you shouldn't be too wordy, and like we're all in this together, we're all the same. That's kind of antithetical to change, right? To change shit, you need to sooner or later stick your head out and be like, no, people, that's not cool. Like, that makes no sense. I know that that's what we've been doing for the past 40 years, but how about we try something new, right? So it takes guts, it takes a little bit of standing out. And something that we've realized after a while of working in this beautiful country is that when we do manage to help managers and leaders and innovators realize that we're not asking them to completely forget about their culture, all we're asking is for them to just take a little bit of a strong step towards innovation and change. It makes a tremendous difference. Why? Because Norwegian companies and employees are insanely technically talented, right? The educational system and the infrastructure and of course the wealth that exists in this country and just your general open mind is incredibly conducive to success. If and only if we're willing to bring down that very, very strong influence of social norms that exists in Norway, right? And a lot of those social norms are indeed tied to Jante.
Yeah, totally. So what do you do? What specific exercises or ways do you help companies or teams overcome these challenges?
Yeah. So we are enormous fans of this concept that I mentioned before, psychological safety. There's been a lot of really cool recent stuff written about this. There's this wonderful book by Amy Edmondson called The Fearless Organization. It's mind-blowing. And it's all based on how to institutionalize environments where sticking your head out is safe. It's not only safe, it's encouraged. Right? And you create this forum of like-minded, empathic people that really are open to people suggesting crazy shit. Doesn't mean that you have to do it. You're just gonna listen to it, right? Embrace it. There's another wonderful book that I know that you and I love and share is Creativity Inc., right? The story of the foundation of Pixar. Holy shit, what a book, right? And literally the whole premise of Ed Catmull, the CEO and author of the book, is that that Pixar grew thanks to very specific rules that they created when they were doing ideation sessions, when they were brainstorming all these amazing movies that they create. They have really strict rules that essentially promote really strong opinions and promote really wacky shit, right? The weirdest of ideas. And then little by little, they craft them through great leadership, great innovation leadership, which is what Percademy does. They craft those crazy, wacky ideas into a cohesive narrative in all the stories that they tell in their movies, right? And so I think that's where companies can benefit significantly from training, from structure, from understanding, and all that. Norwegians are very good at those rules. It's just that you need to find the right rules to institutionalize in an organization if they want to innovate. To give you an example of like what those rules particularly look like, there's this wonderful rule called like the no asshole rule, but the loud person rule. So you don't want an asshole, like definitely not promoting assholes, but you want that really loud person who's constantly being the devil's advocate, right? The annoying person. Why are we doing this and why are we doing that? Why shouldn't we do this? Well, how about we do that, right? Kind of the fixer, the person who's always trying to explore new stuff. You need to help her flourish. What happens usually in big corporations, definitely not going to name names, this happens in many big corporations that we're still working with now, is that person becomes the pariah, right? That person is the person that you need to, like a whack-a-mole. Have you played that game that you need to whack the heads? That person usually gets whacked on the head, and so after 2 or 3 times of getting whacked, she realizes that that's a no-go. If she wants to stay in that organization and climb the ladder, she needs to fall in line. And that will keep the organization at status quo. And sooner or later, another organization where they promote those kinds of ideas, instead of whack-a-mole, they're just going to hop them, beat them to it, and kill them. And there's hundreds of stories about that recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I know that's really close to your heart is meditation and mindfulness.
Yeah.
And that's something you teach a lot in your workshops as well.
Yeah.
And how do you see that tie into like high performing teams and the business world?
Yeah.
What was your journey where you are today?
Yeah, so this is by far like the closest to my heart topic that you could ever have brought up. Surprised that you actually brought it up. Mindfulness has completely changed my life. So laying it out there, I'm very biased, right? I'm not very scientific personally because I feel every single day how this very simple practice has enabled me to live sanely. And so to be a little bit more specific, I've been struggling with really, really, really high levels of anxiety. So it's called generalized anxiety disorder. Since I was very, very young, I was like 7 or 8 when I experienced really, really high levels of anxiety. And I've been trying to manage that ever since. I've gone to a lot of therapy and they've suggested a lot of medication on me. And I've concluded that literally the only thing that has had a true, lasting, manageable, predictable impact on my life has been mindfulness. I'm not saying that it's a cure-all and it's a panacea and that everybody should do it, no. But for me particularly, under my specific circumstances, it's been a complete and utter game changer. So now to your initial question of like, how does it help organizations grow and high performing teams? There's a whole host of benefits that individuals can gain from practicing a little bit of mindfulness. And I say a little because it definitely should just be a little, like 5 minutes a day is enough, right? People shouldn't think that they need to move to Tibet and push themselves into a cave for 5 years.
And I think this is especially relevant for high performing teams.
Yes.
Because you usually think like people that are anxious, they think about the future, and high performers, they think about the future. Depressed people maybe think about the past. So you try to bring them to the now, is that?
Yes, that's part of it, right? One of like the approaches to certain practices in mindfulness is to be very present, to be very aware of where you're at now. So I'll give you an example. During this conversation, I've redirected my attention to my feet 17 times. Right? Why? Because it helps me ground myself, right? It helps me be as present as possible, to be listening to all of your questions as awarely, if that's ever a word, as possible, right? All it takes is a couple of seconds, right? We call these micro mindfulness practices to ground yourself, right? That's just one example. I think where mindfulness can have a tremendous impact on teams, particularly highly stressed, high performing, high delivering teams, is this concept that we discuss all the time in our mindfulness workshops, which is the gap between stimulus and response, right? So most of the time what happens when you're working in a really high pressure team or in a high pressure corporation is that shit happens, right? Like most of the time that I talk to, especially high executives, they're firefighters, right? They're fixing stuff, right? They get paid for that. That's a really stressful thing. And it's very unpredictable, right? Especially when you start to explore more innovation, you don't know what you're getting into. You don't know what you don't know. And so you're getting hit by all these unpredictable things, right? The problem is that when we get hit by these things, we react. We don't respond, we don't pause, we don't acknowledge, we simply react. And sometimes we react with like a violent comment to our colleague, or sometimes we react with a lot of concern, and so we go inwards, right? And so we have people like doubt, why is he quiet now? Especially if you're a leader, right? They're constantly looking at your reactions to difficult situations, right? And so not having that gap to acknowledge that you've been stimulated, to recognize that you're going through what we call an amygdala hijack in kind of neuroscience talk, right? Your amygdala is kind of that part in your brain that responds to intense emotional circumstances. And when that happens, the amygdala starts to like hijack all of like the prefrontal cortex that helps us become more rational and calm and empathetic and stable and balanced, right? And so if you don't have the capacity to say, hey, amygdala, shut the fuck up, like stop, relax, I'm gonna control stuff from the front of my brain, then we get carried away, right? And that's when bad leadership happens. Bad choices are made, right? Teams fall apart, people take stuff personally, right? And so the beauty of mindfulness, and there's lots of wonderful research out there, very, very recent, powerful neuroscience that says that one of the best ways to create that gap between stimulus and response is a dedicated 5-minute mindfulness practice every day for around 6 weeks. You will start to see that as soon as you get triggered, regardless of whether it is a really intense thing, like you're fired, or a less intense thing like, oh, we didn't make the budget this month, regardless of what it is, you start to sense, and the key word here is you start to sense, literally in your body, that moment where you're triggered and the moment where you start to increase that gap that gives you the opportunity to choose how you're going to respond to that trigger. Right. In my opinion, especially in the last 2 years that we've been communicating a lot of mindfulness to a lot of high-performing corporations and teams, that's what makes a tremendous difference. Right? Yeah. Just think about the types of choices that you can make when you're cool, when you're settled, when you're balanced, versus the kind of choices you make when you are highly emotionally triggered.
Totally. And what do you think it does to like the relationships within the team? Do you think it has an impact on that too?
So again, I'm going to talk at a personal level. I don't really know exactly the research around that particular question, so I want to be careful because at the end of the day, I am kind of an academic as well. But I've experienced it, so I experienced it very, very recently. It's a kind of a very personal story. Olga, this wonderful psychologist, she was relatively new to the team, and she was trying to get used to how spontaneous we are at Percademy, because we're very spontaneous. We know each other so well that we kind of read into our body language, and we know what's going to happen. And Ula is kind of like a mind reader. He's always like figuring shit out about what I'm going to do like 2 or 3 seconds before I do it. But then suddenly Olga arrives, and we're expecting the same from her, which was a big mistake from my part. That was like a bad leadership call. Should have explained and communicated much more. Yeah. But she was shocked. She was like, what the hell is going on here, right? You're taking way too many assumptions, and I want to be clued in here. And we were in the middle of a really, really important workshop, the most important workshop that we have ever held with our most amazing client, Williamson, the biggest shipping company in the world. And I remember just like thinking, okay, I've got this wonderful teammate, but she's not understanding how we work, and we have 30 people literally looking at us while this is happening, right? All these really talented students, and I'm just thinking, oh my God. And that was the moment where I said, stop, right? Feel your stomach, because I feel most of my emotions in my stomach. Feel your stomach. And it literally took a couple of seconds to be like, okay, you're getting triggered, right? Respect your teammate. Understand that she's in a really, really difficult situation that, by the way, you put her in, right? And so all of this started to make sense. It wasn't like I was like a Superman and saved the situation, because there was still turmoil and rigidity, but it was way less than what it would have been if I didn't have that capacity to notice that I was being triggered.
Right. It's a good story. We're talking a bit about both meditation and vulnerability and reciprocity. How do you guys do that in Percademy?
Yeah.
Your team,
Yeah.
Because I've heard about your internal workshop. They can get pretty like intense on an emotional level. Is that right?
They are, yeah. So if I understood you correctly, the question is how do we introduce those concepts into our workshops, or how do we embrace them ourselves as a Percademy team?
Percademy team, yeah.
Okay, so that's a really simple question to answer. We try to spend as much personal time together as possible.
Yeah, like you said, good friends.
That's exactly right.
Are the rest of the team friends too?
Oh yeah.
Or are you just...
No. So this is a beautiful thing that although I'd love to spend much more time with them, particularly because we're spread around the entire country. So we've got people in Oslo, and we've got people in Trondheim, we've got people in Bergen and Korea. We also have people in Stanford. Some of my closest friends from Stanford are living in, now they're moved to Seattle. But given all those geographical challenges, we always make it a point to meet at least once or twice the entire team. So last year, we went to Sweden, we went to Stockholm for our Percademy gathering, and it was beautiful. Like, we didn't talk much about business, we talked about ourselves and about the challenges that we were facing and about how we were trying to tackle really meaningful and difficult things in our lives. We're all going through kind of big transitions in our lives. Like I just became a father. Well, it's been 3 years now, but it still feels like it's very, very recent. And some people are moving, and other people are bringing on board new significant others into their family. And so all these things, they're such powerful and important things to share. And so that's what we do. We love great wine and wonderful meals. And so we spend a lot of our budget on just eating really, really good stuff and drinking great wines and beers and meditating together. So that's another beautiful thing. We do a lot of meditation sessions together, and we do like compassion meditation and loving kindness meditation, and a meditation called Tonleng, which is basically like giving and taking. So you like give and receive like very loaded emotional feelings across teammates, right? And it's this incredibly bonding and intimate experience where you are feeling the pain of another person, and at the same time you're receiving their support as well. There's so much beautiful shit that companies can do to help people understand that they're all, one, in this together, and two, that they're all human, right? That they're all gonna struggle through shit once in a while, and that you need to be able to see them as that human and not as a corporate entity, right? Or a number, or even an employee, right? Because at the end of the day, we're much, much more than that.
So, the last part, I have some rapid fire questions.
Go for it.
And you don't have to answer that quickly, but I'm wondering a bit, like, as a leader, and also as a person that teaches leaders how to perform, build high-performing teams. What transitions have you been through lately? Where have you changed your mind in how you approach things or what you teach?
Yeah. So this is another personal one. As you can see, I've always been like good at communicating. Like I talk a lot, and I like it, and I like to be heard, and I have a really big ego, and that initially helped to grow the business, to get the word out there. And I was like the loud American Stanford guy doing creative shit. Hallelujah. Then I ended up realizing that's not where the core value proposition is for my clients. Yeah, getting them excited and getting them pumped up and hyped is important. But I started to realize that the older I got, and I've been getting old quite quickly recently, I started to realize that like practicing what you preach is incredibly important, right? So instead of simply performing, yes, that's important to communicate it, but also truly embrace the stuff that you preach. That has hit me really, really closely in the last, 2-3 years, where I am finally recognizing that a lot of the stuff that I'm teaching, I'm still working on too, right? and that I need to be very, very open and vulnerable about the fact that I'm an NTNU professor, or that I went to a good school, or that I can speak clearly about these topics doesn't mean that I'm dominating them, right? That I've gotten them all covered, right? Particularly around leadership, right? That it's such a difficult thing to do, right? It's a constant and lifelong journey. And I've started to realize that I need to be much more humble. And I think that's something I've learned from living in Norway.
Yeah.
It's humbling how humble Norwegians are. And I'm finally starting to find a balance between the performance side of things and getting people hyped, which is important, but at the same time, taking my own dog food, like taking my own medicine, and being a little bit more reflective about the way that I learn, and in turn the way that I teach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Interesting. You talked a bit about books, but if we're talking here to leaders and people that work with human resources, what kind of books or resources would you recommend them to look into?
I am obsessed with Yuval Noah Harari. That man has, and I can say this hands down, has impressed me more than any other living human being alive. Like, he is, I think he's not human. I think he's like Martian or something. And I know you share this belief. The guy is just so incredible in so many different ways. And it's not only what he teaches through his books and his talks. By the way, his talks are even better than his books, but it's how he does it, right? He takes insanely complex stuff, like the history of mankind, like it doesn't get more complex than that, and he synthesizes it and communicates it in such a human and interesting and profoundly impactful way. So to your question, like, how does this apply to like human resources or managers or leaders? It's about taking complexity, whatever that complexity is, whether it's science or human nature or payroll, and bringing it, because that can be complex, I'm not dissing payroll, is to take all that complexity and in a very, again, human way, synthesize it and serve it to the world.
Right.
I find that absolutely fascinating. And so if you haven't read or seen this man, do it. He's amazing.
Totally second that.
By the way, he's a profound meditator, just to drop that in there. He goes to like 2-month retreats once a year, like hardcore Vipassana silent retreats. So the guy is a profound meditator.
That's one thing you can, if you start doing research on high-performing people, you're going to see that they usually read a lot and they usually meditate.
Yeah, it's happening more and more, at least.
Yeah. How old were you when you graduated from Stanford?
30.
30. So if you were to give advice to a 30-year-old self, what would that advice be? Looking back.
Be kinder.
Be kinder. You were kind? Or?
I wasn't a douchebag, but I can definitely recognize circumstances where I could have been much more understanding, much more empathetic, much more compassionate. And by the way, that applies to others, but even more to myself.
Okay.
I am hyperly self-critical. And by the way, that's really common in the corporate space. And on the entrepreneurship space. Like, high performance generally happens because we are constantly lashing ourselves, like, perform. And that's not healthy. No. I've lived many, many years of like self-flagellation at all levels, at like corporate performance levels and educational levels and just personal levels.
And you do triathlon as well.
Exactly. That's another huge, like, I want to inflict pain on myself, right? So I hop onto a bike for 4 hours and just suffer the hell out of it. And then get off of it and be like, yeah, I suffer, right? There's something weird about that. And so I would tell myself 10 years ago, I would be like, dude, kindness helps you lead a much healthier life. and it helps others do the same.
But I suppose you still need some of that kind of self-improvement.
Totally. And so this is an interesting conversation that I have sometimes with people, particularly when I talk about compassion and self-compassion, because that's another area that we've been really introducing into our leadership work at Percademy. People think that kindness and compassion and all these kinds of things and empathy, it's like you're being weak, right? You're letting yourself off the hook, right? You're being lazy, right? You're not being rigorous enough. And I would say that that's a terrible misunderstanding of what we really mean by compassion and kindness. When I say compassionate and kind, you need to keep the bar high, but if you don't make it, you don't jump over that bar, you need to figure out ways to learn from it in a really soothing, authentic, and kind fashion, right?
That's interesting.
And if you set the bar high and you don't make it, because most of the times we're setting the bar higher and higher, I want more money, a nicer car, a bigger house, and bigger position, and right, you will eventually fall. And when you fall and you treat yourself like shit, you're not going to learn from it, right? So it's not only being kind, but it's also being really smart, right? But it's a difficult, subtle differentiation there between letting yourself off the hook and just treating yourself with a little bit more kindness. Did I kind of describe a little bit of the differences there?
That's very good, very good. Looking back at your career, what's been your best failure? What that you've learned the most from?
Oh, that's a really simple one to answer as well. When I graduated from my MBA, I had this crazy idea. And the idea was to help place low-income Mexican laborers who had lots of skills with their hands, particularly like mechanics and welders, to find legal job opportunities in Spain. Instead of having these low-income, low-education, generally young men travel north into the US and just struggle with all the horrible shit that we know that happens to Mexican immigrants, illegal immigrants in the US. And so during that time, while I was graduating, 2008, maybe a little bit earlier, 2007, Spain in particular had this huge list of job opportunities that weren't being fulfilled by Spaniards, that could be filled by Latin Americans, including Mexicans. And I was like, done, this is wonderful, right? I understand Spain, right? I understand Mexico. I'm gonna find these laborers, I'm gonna send them to Spain, they're gonna fill these jobs, and it's gonna be awesome, and we're gonna be like manpower for the poor, right? It just made total sense to me. And then there was something called the financial crisis of 2008, right? And so Spain went from having, I don't know, like an unemployment rate of like 4% marginal to having an unemployment rate of like 25% in less than a year, right? So the whole business model just completely fell apart. I had no plan B, right? And I was also a bit overly aggressive, overly ambitious, a bit arrogant, that everything will fall into place. I've got this covered, right? And I was starting to see things change, and I was ignoring them, and I was pushing them under the rug, and I got a really good chunk of money from my alma mater to push this forward. And so there was all these responsibilities that I had set up for myself, and I wasn't honest enough with myself that the business model was eventually going to fall apart, and it fell apart. And then fortunately enough, I was working with a really talented partner, Conchita Galdon, who had just during the same time had received her master's from Harvard. She was interested in exactly the same concept, and she moved to Madrid, and she essentially saved the model. So instead of bringing workers from Mexico into Spain, Conchita started to work with immigrants that were already living in Spain, and she helped them become entrepreneurs. And now the company's still going strong.
Oh, nice.
But that was definitely a big failure, and it was a failure I could have prevented if I would have been a little bit more self-aware.
Yeah. Cool. Lastly, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience? Is there like, I know for myself that we've had tremendous learning from your workshops. How can people get in touch with you, and what do you guys usually do for companies and teams and such?
Yeah. So the first and easiest place to go is percademy.co. Maybe we can add some kind of link there, or it's simple. that's kind of the first place. But what I would definitely say is that there's kind of two different layers to what we offer. One is like just one-off, quick, but very impactful workshops, generally around like sprints, like design sprints, or the design thinking mindset, or these kinds of workshops. They generally just last 1 or 2 days, and it gives organizations a general good sense of what we do. It's not enough though, but it's a good start, right? And they're important to get people curious. What we're trying to do now as an organization, and this is where the team comes in as well, is that we are trying our best to establish longer-term relationships with organizations that are taking innovation and innovation leadership very seriously, right? And so these relationships, they last many years. They involve many different interventions, everything from workshops to leadership development programs that last multiple modules, to global programs where we handhold teams to help them implement a lot of the tools that we share with them, to mentoring programs, to coaching. So we really want to enable organizations at all kinds of levels and instances to ensure that they have the capabilities necessary to lead into the 21st century. Yeah. Those are the relationships that we're really, really looking for.
Nice. Fede, it's been a pleasure having you here.
My pleasure, my friend. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hei sann, håper du lærte noe fra intervjuet der, og om du har lyst til å lære mer om dette veldig spennende temaet, så har vi laget en e-bok som heter Rekruttering i 2019, og du kan laste ned den e-boka helt gratis nå ved å trykke på linken i innlegget her. Lykke til!